Hello, dear students, and welcome back to this discussion on modern Indian history. Guys, the Portuguese were the first to seize the initiative and establish their control over Indian Ocean region's trade. Using their fast ships, powerful guns, and a lot of guts, they were able to suppress the littoral states of Indian Ocean region, including many in India. Consequently, for a very long period, they were able to enjoy a monopoly of trade in the Indian Ocean region, but this was not to last forever. Very soon, they were rivaled, challenged, and shattered by a European power, which is going to inaugurate a new series of struggles amongst the rival European players in this region. I, Jawwad Kazi, in this episode, I'm going to discuss about the rise of other rival European powers in this region, and we are going to start it with arrival of the Dutch in India, guys. In case you are new over here, then in this series, we are taking up discussion on modern Indian history based on StudyIQ IAS's textbook of the same name. If you have not seen earlier episodes, I recommend that you watch this episode and definitely see the playlist of the series and watch the earlier episodes as well. So let's get started with our discussion on the Dutch. We have already covered Portuguese in our last session, guys. Here is a map of Southeast Asia as ruled by different European colonial powers. Now, this map is of a subsequent period, but nevertheless, it will be crucial for you to have a visualization of the region. Guys, the Dutch were attracted primarily towards the Southeast Asia. The famed spices of Southeast Asia were immensely popular in Europe. It was the black pepper of Southeast Asia that made their meat palatable and also fit for eating for a long period of time. Nutmeg, clover, cinnamon sticks, and several other spices of this region were of high value in this trade between Asia and Europe. So it was very natural for the Dutch to be attracted towards this region for the sake of the spices. But when they came over here, they realized that they did not have anything of value to sell to the people living here. Whatever goods they had were not in demand in Southeast Asia. But smart as they were, they quickly learned that people in Southeast Asia are simply crazy about Indian products, Indian goods. Especially textiles that are made in India were immensely popular in the humid climates of this region. And therefore, the Dutch will be drawn towards India. They will come to India to buy Indian products, which could be then sold at a profit over here, and that profit could then be invested in buying the spices of this region. So this is a sort of triangular or redistributive trade that will be done by the Dutch for the sake of earning profits in this trade. Before we go ahead, let us have a quick overview of this map so that you will be able to better relate with European colonialism in this region. This is on a side note, but it is very crucial for subsequent discussions as well. So let's have a look. In the pink shaded regions, the pink shaded areas represent British Burma, first on the westernmost part. Below is Malaya, and to its east is Borneo. East of the British region is the buffer zone of Siam or modern day Thailand. Thailand or Siam was able to maintain its autonomy, but at the cost of a lot of humiliation as it was sandwiched between two rival powers. To its west were the British and to its east were the French. The blue shaded area is the one that was controlled by French colonists. Modern day Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, referred to as Indochina back then, were under French control. The orange shaded regions are actually the Dutch East Indies, and yellow shaded areas are the Spanish East Indies, and a small patch was also occupied by the Portuguese in the form of Timor. So in this manner, guys, the entire Southeast Asian landmass was parceled out amongst rival European players. And you can see here, a very crucial strategic point was occupied by the Dutch and on the other side by the British. This is the famous choke point of Malacca Strait, which I have discussed with you in my last session. Now let us see, guys, how the Dutch company will be formed and how its rule is going to evolve here in India. So let's get started with that. The Dutch company was formed in 1602 as a corporation or a company, joint stock company, with a charter from the crown to trade with the East. So charter was an official document which gave a monopoly right to this company for trading with the East. Back then, guys, in the age of mercantilism, the states believed in making maximum profit through trade. And for this purpose, the instrument that was used was monopoly. Instead of allowing competition, back then, countries felt that monopolies served the economic interest of a country better. And therefore, they allowed only one entity to indulge in this trade with the East. The British did that, so did the French. This kind of monopoly corporations were created during these mercantile times. In case you have not yet seen my video on mercantilism, I will strongly recommend that you click on the World History series link and watch the video on mercantilism to understand the dynamics behind these developments. In 1605, they finally became wiser and came to India and established a factory at Masulipatnam on the east coast of India. This was their first factory. Later, they captured Amboyana in Indonesia from the Portuguese. The Portuguese, who earlier had complete monopoly of trade in Indian Ocean region, their monopoly was shattered by the Dutch. That naval monopoly was shattered. In 1623, a landmark event will start a long rivalry between Dutch and their rival British companies. Both the Dutch and the Britishers wanted to edge each other out from this very lucrative trade. Just as these companies had monopoly in their own country, they also wanted to have overall monopoly for the trade in this region. And this often led to crossing of paths between these companies and fights amongst them. In Amboyana, the Dutch had massacred some officials of the East India Company, and that is referred to as this Amboyana massacre, which will start a long rivalry between the Dutch and the British. The British will not forget it and will always want to get one up with them, leading to a lot of conflicts over the next few decades. In 1658, they also took Sri Lanka from the Portuguese. Sri Lanka again was crucial because the Sri Lankan products were also in huge demand in Southeast Asia, apart from being in demand in Europe also. So the Dutch were very keen to get this region from the Portuguese. You can note, guys, how by this time the Portuguese have virtually become irrelevant. They are not even playing a second fiddle role. It is the English and the Dutch who had much more stronger navies who are now competing for the #1 position in Indian Ocean region trade. In 1667, this long rivalry between the Dutch and the British, which had led to a lot of bickerings, a lot of fights between the two, was tried to be settled by a settlement between the two sides. Under this, the Dutch were to be left alone in Indonesia, and in return, the Dutch will not. The Dutch promised that they will not hamper British trade in India. In 1759, there was a famous battle fought between the two in Bengal, known as the Battle of Bedera. The Battle of Bedera, 1759, English East India Company was able to comprehensively defeat the Dutch company, after which the Dutch will not remain a player of any consequence in India. Finally, in 1795, the Dutch will be expelled from India, although there will be some lingering presence. So in this manner, guys, the domination of the Portuguese was first challenged by the Dutch. Their naval monopoly was shattered by the Dutch, and then the English and Dutch, they compete with each other, ultimately the English emerging victorious and expelling the Dutch from India. So this was like a relay race sort of going on. The Portuguese first monopolize and dominate, then the Dutch take over from them, and then finally the English. Let us know about some of the major factories that were established by the Dutch, as this will be very crucial for prelims MCQ type questions. The first factory that they established in India was in Pulicat, which is north of Madras, which was the headquarters for British on East Coast. So first factory is on the East Coast in Pulicat. Then in 1616, factory was established in Surat. Now you, I'm sure, must have noted that all the European companies are keen to establish factories at Surat. Why is that so? Because Surat was a very crucial, you can say, port town for Mughal India, and it was very easy for the Britishers to get in over there, to bring in their products and then take it across to the country, and vice versa, buying products across the country, northern India particularly, and then via Surat taking it on the sea lanes and towards Europe. Surat therefore was extremely crucial. This prized possession of Surat will later be taken over by Bombay when British get hold of it, but that will be some time away. Factories were then established at Bimilipatnam in Andhra Pradesh, Karaikal in Puducherry in 1645, and then in Bengal in Chinsura. So you can see the start is first from South India, then a factory at Surat, then another one in South, and then in Bengal also. By the time they established factory in Bengal, it is 1653. Then after that, several factories were established: Baranagar in Bengal, Kasim Bazar near Murshidabad, Balasore in Odisha, Patna in Bihar, and Nagapattinam again in Tamil Nadu, South India. Nagapattinam will later become the headquarters of the Dutch. Earlier it was Pulicat, being the first factory, that was the headquarters, but later on it will be shifted to Nagapattinam. They also established a factory on the west coast at Cochin. If you see, the Dutch trading activity is concentrated more on the eastern side of India. Why is that so? Again, understand the logic behind that they are more keen about trade with Southeast Asia, and they are coming to India basically to buy Indian products which could then be sold at profit in Southeast Asia. And hence it was more convenient to have stronger presence on the eastern coast of India. Not that they did not have factories on the west, they did, but then they are more concentrated on the eastern side. That is the reason behind it. And what were the products they were looking for? The products were indigo. They participated in this redistributive trade of indigo from Yamuna Valley and central India. In our last class, we have seen the role of indigo as a natural dye. Indigo was very crucial for coloring clothes, and the climate of this part of India, central India, Yamuna, their indigo cultivation was very suitable, and therefore it became a very important crop back then, which the Dutch used to buy and sell in other places. Textiles and silk. Dutch traded in textiles and silk from Bengal, Gujarat, as well as the Coromandel coast, which was then sold in Southeast Asia. Then saltpeter. I hope you remember this very crucial item of saltpeter, which was a very, very lucrative trade item for the Europeans. Saltpeter from Bihar was used in manufacturing of gunpowder, which was so crucial, guys, for firing of big cannon guns and even small ones. Without this saltpeter, gunpowder could not be made, and without gunpowder, big guns could not be fired. These same big guns enabled European rulers to blast their way through the castles of feudal lords. Feudalism in Europe will come to an end thanks to the big powerful guns that European monarchs built. And those big powerful guns depended on saltpeter for being fired. So you can imagine the kind of importance it must have had back then. Similarly, opium and rice of the Ganga Valley was also a very crucial item of trade. Opium, it was used for medical purposes and also as a recreational item back then, and continues to be a part of the culture even to this date. So opium was used in that sense. Guys, you can see how the Dutch people were smart and they used Indian products to get a foothold in the trade of Southeast Asia, where they had their ambition. And if you are also smart enough and want to make the most of the opportunity that you have at your hand, then I strongly recommend that you enroll for the upcoming long-term batch of StudyIQ IAS. This long-term batch of StudyIQ IAS is basically designed for targeting the attempt of 2025. Many of you might be students or they might be working professionals, and consequently targeting 2025 would be a more ideal target for you considering your other engagements, and therefore P2I batch, long-term batch of StudyIQ IAS is an ideal solution for you. It has everything on offer that P2I regular batch has to offer you, but the only difference being it is intended for 2025's attempt, keeping in mind the cohort of students who have certain other commitments which do not allow them to appear in 2024. Available in all different mediums, English, Hindi and English. This batch is starting very shortly, and I will recommend that you definitely enroll for this batch and use my code for the same so that you get a handsome discount on this. 16th of September, this batch is starting at 6 p.m. in the evening. This is going to be an evening batch, guys. Also, time is still there for you to quickly enroll for the regular batch, the batch of P2I targeting 2024. 11 September batch, which is a morning batch, has already started. You can quickly enroll. This is just the first week. We have only done the orientation classes now. Subject teaching has as yet not started. So you can enroll for that batch if your target is 2024. You can use my code JDLive for that purpose to get a handsome discount on this. Okay? You can also reach out to me on my Telegram channel, from where you can download my notes and also get updates of my upcoming videos. All right, guys. Now, let us see the map of Portuguese presence in India so that you can visualize where exactly their factories were located. You can see the first factory starts out at Masulipatnam, or Mashilipatnam as it is known now. Then the factories are concentrated more on the eastern side, as we have noted. Nizampatnam, Pulikat, Nagapatnam, where the capital will be or headquarter will be transferred later. Bhimilipatnam in Andhra, Balasore in Orissa, Kasim Bazar and Chinsura in Bengal. Okay, so these were the areas where the Dutch were present. The Dutch thus shattered Portuguese monopoly, were intended for spice trade of Malaya, and therefore they were not keen on empire building in India. Their focus was primarily on trade, and trade because Indian products were required for trading in Southeast Asia. Ultimately, in 1824, the Anglo-Dutch settlement, final settlement takes place, after which the Dutch gave up their position in India and bid goodbye and went and just ruled in their Southeast Asian possessions of Dutch East Indies. This is how the Dutch, you can say, connection of Indian history will come to an end in 19th century. Now, we are going to come to the next crucial player in this theme of advent of Europeans in India, that is arrival of the British East India Company. Company Bahadur, which is going to leave an indelible impact on the history of India. No, annal of history of India subsequent to that has remained unaffected by the impact of the rule of East India Company. It is so amazing, guys, that a corporation, a company, joint stock company created in a country more than 20,000 nautical miles away was able to dominate such a massive subcontinent. It was able to defeat such powerful Indian princes. They humbled Mysore. They defeated Bengal. They defeated Awadh. They defeated the almighty Marathas of that day and age. They were able to overcome Punjab, annex Sindh, and control the whole of Indian subcontinent. And this was not by a state. This was being done by a financial corporation. How did this happen? How did a company muster the kind of resources, tact to achieve this feat? Is going to be the theme that we are going to discuss in the lectures to come. Guys, this is very intriguing. You know, East India Company had an army in India which was twice the size of the army of Britain. A corporation of that country has an army, private army, which is twice the size of the country's army. This is a fantastic story. I mean, this is not to condone what East India Company did, but it's intriguing to understand how can a corporation achieve all of this success. That story is now coming up. But first, we need to understand the foundations of this company. So let us trace the evolution of the company in the initial phase so that we can build a robust base to see how it will drastically transform into a ruler later. In 1599, this company was established first as a joint stock company. It's established like what? As a joint stock company. Europe back then was going through the phase of mercantilism, where trade and commerce with the outside world was prioritized by European players. This trade and commerce was expected to earn profit for the country and make it rich and powerful. And for that purpose, this vehicle was created called as joint stock company. People who had some resources, disposable income, they could come together and subscribe to the shares of this corporation, become shareholders, and this corporation will then trade on their behalf. So in 1599, this corporation was formed and it got a monopoly to trade with the East through a charter issued in 1600. For 15 years, this company will have a monopoly to trade with the East. No other British person will be allowed. British person, I mean both human or legal person. No other company will also be allowed to trade with the East. Queen Elizabeth had given this charter to the East India Company. In 1609, this charter was renewed even before it was exhausted. It was there for 15 years initially, but it was renewed, and this time they were given an indefinite period monopoly. Okay, so they will continue to trade with the East. In 1609, Captain Hawkins comes to the court of Jahangir. Okay, he comes, anchors the ship at Surat, and then reaches the court of Jahangir after one long year. I mean, the entire travel and everything was very difficult back then. There were other challenges also. So a year later, he reaches the court of Jahangir, where he tries to convince the Mughal ruler to allow English people to set up their factory in Surat. Now, Jahangir's attitude towards the East India Company was not very positive. Although he entertained Hawkins, but then he did not give him permission to set up the factory, lest the Portuguese get offended. The Portuguese influence was already strong at the Mughal court, and they tried their best to frustrate the attempts of Hawkins, and consequently, Jahangir did not give them the permission. Now, Jahangir was concerned that if English are given permission, then the Portuguese will get offended and they will then hamper Mughal trade in the Arabian Sea. The Portuguese were already quite notorious for doing many sort of things at the high seas, and even the mighty Mughals knew that they were helpless when it came to what was happening on the sea. Although the Mughals were rulers on the land, but the sultans of the sea were the Portuguese at that point of time. So Jahangir entertains him. He got him married to a Armenian Christian lady and sent Hawkins back without giving him any permission. In 1611, therefore, they established a factory in South India where till that point, Mughal control was not there. Masulipatam is where they establish it. 1612, Portuguese Navy was defeated by the British Navy under Captain Best near Surat. The British realized that if they are to get permission from the Mughals, they will have to do a show of strength. They will have to show the Mughals that they are equal, if not more competent than the Portuguese at the high seas. That is the only thing that will give the Mughals confidence to allow them to set up factories in India. So in 1612, the British are able to achieve that and defeat the Portuguese at the sea. This will now change Mughal opinion about the English people. Therefore, British were given the permission to set up a factory at Surat in 1613. That was the most important Mughal trading port. In 1615, then another ambassador was sent at the court of Jahangir, Thomas Roe. Remember the names, guys. The first fellow is Hawkins and the second fellow is Roe. Thomas Roe came as ambassador of King James I to India. He brought a lot of gifts for Jahangir, and Jahangir was a man of curiosity and learning. He wanted to know and understand what was happening in different parts of the world, and those gifts really enticed Jahangir, especially the paintings. Jahangir, all Mughal princes had a keen eye for different fine arts, and Jahangir was especially very keen and very much into paintings. He was himself a painter, and he had a desire of having his own studio as a prince as well. He had entertained a lot of painters, and he wanted to know how the art of painting was done in Europe. So finally, he was impressed in 1615 by this ambassador, and then he allowed the Britishers to set up factories in other places also. So we have seen how the East India Company was formed, how its representatives came to India, how they were able to establish a factory at Surat, and then get permission for factories in other parts of the empire. So factories were therefore now set up at Agra, Ahmedabad, Bharuch and Baroda under the Surat administration itself. Okay. Surat being the headquarters of the English at this point of time on the western coast. Other settlements which came up subsequently, we must know some of the names of the factories here. Armagaon near Pulicat on the east, 1626. Hariharpur and Balasore in Odisha in 1633. Crucially, Hooghly. You remember the Portuguese had also established a factory there? Hooghly in 1651, and later on in Patna, Dhaka and Qasim Bazar. Patna in Bihar and then the other two in Bengal. These were established by the Britishers. This is how one after another the British are able to establish factories. Now what are factories? We have discussed earlier. These are warehouses for goods that the Europeans were trading in. Please remember that. Okay. Now, East India Company during this period was able to get many things in its favor. As luck would have it, they were able to get many things which laid the foundation of their subsequent advancement in India. What were these? Francis Day, a British officer, got the permission of fortifying factory at Madras in 1639. Madras then became the headquarters for the Britishers in South India. They will shift their headquarters to Madras. Madras we are using as it is referred to by the Britishers. Golconda Sultan gave the Golden Farman, remember this Farman, in 1651 for free trade in the ports of East. Okay, 1651 Golden Farman by Golconda Sultan. Anglo-Dutch Compromise of 1667. The Europeans in India, there was a triangular struggle at this point that was going on. Portuguese, who were the old players but by now quite weak, and the subsequent two arrivals of English and the Dutch. There was this triangular struggle between all these three. Now, although the Portuguese, since the Portuguese had become weak, the primary struggle was now between whom? Between the English and the Dutch. The Dutch were concerned more with Southeast Asian trade, but for Southeast Asian trade, they required goods in India. So therefore, they come into conflict with the English over here. Now, this conflict is finally settled through the agreement in 1667, whereby both promise non-interference in respective areas. Dutch will not interfere with English here in India, and the English will not interfere with the Dutch in Dutch East Indies or Indonesia. So this arrangement proved to be a great boon for the Britishers for their subsequent rise. The Portuguese had also realized that they were no more in a position to take on both rival European powers. They had to come to settlements, come to terms with one of them. And the Portuguese chose English in this context because the Portuguese had suffered a lot more at the hands of the Dutch. You remember they had taken over Sri Lanka and also Amboyana from the Portuguese itself. So the Portuguese come to terms with the English and try to have a patch up with them. And as a part of this understanding between the Portuguese and the English, a marital arrangement was made between the two royal families. King Charles II of Portuguese and Princess Catherine of Braganza, King Charles II of the English and Princess Charles, Princess Catherine Braganza of the Portuguese, they were to be married. And at the time of this marriage, the island of Bombay was gifted to King Charles. Okay, this was gifted to King Charles. In some textbooks, you will come across the term, it was given as a dowry. Now, dowry is not an appropriate term to describe this because dowry is a practice with us, in India where there is an unequal kind of a relationship. Here, the more appropriate term is gifted. So in standard reference book, mostly the term gift will be used, whereas in notes and many other things, sometimes the term dowry will be used, which is not an appropriate term there. So it was gifted to the English in 1662. Then later, the royals will transfer this to the company. Bombay will be transferred to the company in 1668. Bombay was a group of 7 islands, guys, back then when the Portuguese gifted it to the English and English gave it to East India Company, and there was a nominal you can say lease arrangement made between the crown and the company. These 7 islands, then the governor, he got the land reclaimed from the sea and got these 7 islands connected. That is how the island city of Mumbai was created during British times. Bombay will become very crucial for them on the western coast. Later, Surat being vulnerable to attacks, especially with the rise of Marathas and Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj himself having attacked Surat twice, the Britishers found it wiser to actually shift their capital to Bombay on the western coast. Okay. Now let us see hostile British-Mughal relations. In 1686, British had this notion that they were strong enough to actually take on a dominant Indian power like the Mughals. And back then the ruler was Aurangzeb. So Aurangzeb was a powerful Mughal ruler, and in his times, Britishers showed the audacity of attacking Hooghly in Bengal. So Mughals responded very strongly and they captured all British settlements across Bengal in 1687. So offense was first given by EIC. The Mughals respond by capturing all British settlements in Bengal. Subsequently, British became hostile to Mughals and they started to affect the trade of Mughals on the seas. Mughal ships were attacked, Hajj pilgrims were also attacked, and this led to a lot of consternation, a lot of hostility between British and Mughals. In 1688-89, Aurangzeb took some decisive measures and he captured all British settlements across the Mughal Empire to teach the East India Company a lesson. 1690, Britishers realized that they cannot, continue this hostile relations with Mughals. They are yet not powerful enough to take on such a mighty Indian prince, and therefore they surrendered to the Britishers and Mughals also pardoned them. Here is a crucial point, guys. Although it was the East India Company which had actually started the hostility, Mughals were responding to that. But when East India Company surrenders, immediately even the emperor pardons them. Why was that so? The reason behind that was the Mughals also understood that this hostility cannot perpetually continue because at the seas, now East India Company is dominant. Mughal trade would be very badly affected. Hajj pilgrims will be very badly affected if this hostility continues perpetually. So even they did not have any other choice but to pardon and get along again with East India Company now that they had become humble petitioners. Consider this, guys. 1690, they are coming and humbly surrendering before the Mughal emperor. And in 1857, the same East India Company will sever the heads of several Mughal princes and offer that in a tray to the last Mughal ruler, the unfortunate old man, Bahadur Shah Zafar. Just see the transformation of East India Company. When they had come before Jahangir, they were begging and pleading to allow them permission for setting up factories. And that same East India Company, down the centuries, is severing the head of Mughal princes and serving it as a gift to the Mughal ruler. It reminds me of a couplet from a Qawwali. Allow me indulgence to share that very briefly. The Shair in that Qawwali says, "Sochta hu ke wo kitne masoom the," when they came as, traders initially. "Sochta hu ke wo kitne masoom the, kya se kya ho gaye, dekhte dekhte." That is the transformation of East India Company. We're going to see that whole story. In 1691, after this surrender, not only were they pardoned, but also a farman was issued which gave custom duty exemption to the East India Company in Bengal. So they are also getting privileges. In return of this exemption, they had to pay an annual payment to the Mughal crown. So these are the relations between East India Company and the Mughals in the 17th century, 17th, 18th century. So now we are going to go ahead and see our discussion on emergence of some of the major British presidency towns, starting with Madras first. How was Madras born? The permission of setting up factory over here was given to the English by Raja of Chandragiri, Francis Day, official of East India Company. He got this permission in 1639. This was a successor sort of state from the Vijayanagar. After the decline of Vijayanagar, we see the fracturing up of its polity. When we discuss Mysore, you remember that class? We have seen how Mysore was also born out of Vijayanagar. So similarly, many other Nayak kingdoms were born, and one such kingdom was under the control of Raja of Chandragiri, and his permission was obtained by Francis Day to set up a factory there. A factory was set up there in the name of Fort St. George. Fort St. George. Madras now became the headquarters of all the British settlements on the Coromandel coast by replacing Masulipatam. Earlier, the capital used to be Masulipatam. Now Madras was made as the headquarters on Coromandel coast. Coromandel coast is the eastern coast along the states of Tamil Nadu and Andhra. 1658, all settlements in Coromandel and eastern India also were brought under Fort St. George. So not only on the Coromandel coast, but entire east coast was now going to be under Fort St. George's administration. So this is a very crucial position that Fort St. George had. It is the headquarters of the entire eastern coast for the East India Company in India, guys. This is how the city of Madras is created. Then after this comes the next important city of Calcutta. Let's see how Calcutta is born. In 1651, they first get a farman from Shah Chuja, Mughal governor, for trading in Bengal. Factories were to be set up in Hooghly, Qasim Bazar, Patna, and Rajmahal. In all of these areas, East India Company was able to set up the factories. You remember where do they start out with? They start out first with Surat, 1613. And then subsequently, they start to establish factories in other parts of Mughal dominion. But here, creation of Calcutta, the first initial attempt is when they get a farman from Shah Shuja and establish factories in Bengal. In 1690, remember the context? Just before this, they had a conflict with the Mughals. They surrendered, they were pardoned, and then in 1690, Job Charnock, remember the name of this person? Job Charnock established a factory at a place called as Sutanati. at a place called as Sutanati, he establishes a factory. In 1696, this place will be fortified. Fortification will be done. Now you might wonder, why do these European companies want to fortify their factories? The reason behind that was, guys, that these were medieval times where there was constant warfare, a lot of flux. Neighboring kingdoms frequently attacked. Marathas were rising and their rise was very disruptive also. There used to be a lot of raids and all kingdoms were practicing this against each other. Now in that process, European companies felt unsafe to have their valued wares unprotected. And for that reason, they constantly try to fortify their possessions so that they can defend against any sort of attacks, invasions or raids. In 1698, British acquired zamindari of 3 villages. Which were these 3 villages? Sutanati, which was already, they had presence over there, but they get now zamindari also. Govindpur and Kalikata. Kalikata. Okay. The term or name Calcutta is basically derived from this same village of Kalikata. Okay. I hope you got this. So these 3 villages were acquired by the East India Company with zamindari rights, and here the city of Calcutta will basically develop over the area of these 3 villages. In 1700, a new fortified structure was created, which was called as now Fort William. We have here Fort St. George, Fort of Madras. And here it is Fort William, which will be the kernel of Calcutta basically. Administered by President and his council. Later on, Calcutta will become most important, Bengal will become most important after the Battle of Buxar dual government experiments. We'll see that in due course, and it will become the capital of British India. From 1700, all settlements in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa were brought under Fort William's administration. East Coast is under Fort St. George, whereas Bengal, Bihar, Orissa, all the positions over there, that will come under Fort William. Remember these terms, guys. Small prelims based bit type questions can be made out of these facts. So we saw 2 important presidency towns, which are Madras and Calcutta. Now let us see the next one, which is Bombay. Okay. As we noted earlier, it was gifted to the company by the Portuguese, and then the royals transferred it to the company. This replaced Surat as headquarters on western coast. Surat, if you remember, was attacked by Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj. East India Company felt that they have a better chance of defending Bombay considering its island-like nature, and therefore they shift their headquarters on the western coast of the entire western coast from Surat to Bombay. All right. Now comes the very important development of Farrukhsiyar's Farman of 1717. Farrukhsiyar's Farman of 1717. What is this Farman and what is the role that it is going to play? Let us see that. This is also referred to as the Magna Carta of East India Company, alluding to the very seminal document from British history, okay, which is the base for, you can say, the development of a responsible government can be traced back in British history right up to the Magna Carta. Okay, it was a very humble beginning, nevertheless a very seminal one. So on similar lines, Farrukhsiyar's Farman of 1717 can be ranked. It so happened that Farrukhsiyar had become ill, and incidentally at that time a British delegation had come visiting the Mughal crown. On learning of the emperor's illness, the doctor who was accompanying the East India Company, his services were offered to the Mughal emperor. The services were availed, and it is reported that he benefited from that service. And like typically, rulers of that time, they do when they are served well by other people, they announce something very grandiose for them. So Farrukhsiyar also made a very terrible mistake, which is going to cost the Mughals, especially the Nawabs of Bengals, very dearly in the years or decades to come. Trade concessions were given by Farrukhsiyar in this Farman to East India Company in Gujarat, Bengal and Hyderabad. What were the concessions that were given? exemption of taxes from trade in Bengal for an annual fee. Just pay an annual fee, a certain amount, and in return, you will not have to pay any taxes to the Mughals. Just an annual fee. So irrespective of what your quantum of trade is, see, taxes on trade are always based on value. But here it has been capped. There is an annual fee, which is the maximum amount that you will have to pay to the state. Permission to issue dastaks. This will become a very contentious issue later on. What was meant by dastaks? Now, since East India Company was allowed to trade duty-free, it had to prove to Mughal officials that the goods being traded belonged to East India Company. And for that purpose, a document was to be issued, which is called as the dastak, which vouched for the fact that the goods being traded belonged to East India Company, and therefore they were exempt from paying any taxes on it. This document was referred to as the dastak. Okay. Later on, there will be gross abuse of this document of dastak. Private officials of East India Company's officials, they indulged in private trade. So while the company was trading, alongside that, company's officials also conducted or did private trade. They also invested their money and bought and sold stuff. These dastaks, which were to be used exclusively for company's purpose, were issued fraudulently for the private trade of company officials also. And this naturally resulted in losses to Mughal exchequer, which will ultimately lead to measures that will result in Battle of Plassey and later Battle of Buxar as well. So we'll see that context as we reach there. But remember, the origin is here in Farrukhsiyar's Farman. They got the permission to rent more land around Calcutta, around that area. Freedom from tax duties in Hyderabad as well as in Madras. Similarly, on payment of 10,000 rupees annually, which back then of course was a big amount, but nothing in comparison to what their tax burden would have been otherwise. So they just have to pay 10,000 rupees for all the trade that they do in Surat. And Surat being the most important place for trade, naturally this amount pales into insignificance considering what the Mughals were foregoing on trade. Company coins to be minted at Bombay as currency. Company got the right to mint its coins also. So this Farman of Farrukhsiyar was a very landmark Farman for the East India Company. It cemented the roots of East India Company in India. All right. So on that note, guys, we will conclude our discussion for today regarding East India Company. In the next session, we are going to see how a Johnny come lately, that is the French company, is going to challenge the East India Company's role in India, leading to conflicts between the two. The Anglo-French wars or the Carnatic wars will take place in the 18th century. The history of the French company and of those wars is coming up in our next lecture, guys. So stay tuned with me. If you found this lecture useful and valuable, then do leave some love in the comment box below and like this video, share it with your friends. Thank you very much. I'll see you in my next session.